What if I told you Alauddin Khilji's most dreaded general by the name Malik Kafur was also his controversial lover? And also, would you believe that India had a king with an African origin back in 16th century who died undefeated against the Mughals? What if I told you one of the kings of the great Vijayanagar dynasty in southern part of India spent a good amount of his time authoring a book on erotica which had 32 stanzas on different types of oral sex while his kingdom was in a total disarray? And you know why? Because he killed his own brother. All this makes you wonder I'm talking about some fiction novel or some book on alternate history, right? Sorry to disappoint, but no. Welcome to Books and Brew, and I'm your host Mayur Ghatge. Today I'm going to talk about a book called Rebel Sultans. It's written by Manu Pillai. This book focuses on the history of Deccan region after Khilji and before Shivaji. So the timeline is dated from late 13th century to late 17th century. To the listeners who are not aware of the Deccan region, it is a region of India which comprises of modern day state of Maharashtra and the other states south of it. I'll talk about three things from the book I like and will later discuss one of the earliest known type of coffee to maintain the theme of history for this episode. So stay tuned. First, I'd like to briefly go through the timeline in the book. So the story in the book starts in the 13th century when the Deccan was home to three kingdoms. Yadavs led the region that is roughly modern day Maharashtra. Kakatiyas ruled the pre 2014 Andhra Pradesh, and Hoysalas ruled modern day Karnataka. The Delhi Sultanate was ruled by Turkish descendants, and they feared coming down south to attack any of these three kingdoms. The first of them to march south and capture the Deccan was Alauddin Khilji, who took the Yadavs by surprise and captured the Marathi land. His controversial lover and general Malik Kafur then defeated the Kakatiyas to broaden the scope of the Delhi Sultanate. But Alauddin Khilji wasn't successful to capture the entire Deccan. After the death of Alauddin Khilji, the Delhi Sultanate was led by another nutty character, and his name is Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who later came down south and ended the Kakatiyas and Hoysalas to rule the Deccan entirely. Under Tughlaq's regime, the Delhi Sultanate grew till the modern day state of Tamil Nadu, but all his governors in the south would eventually rebel against him, and he got really frustrated. There is an anecdote in the book, and which I quote: the Sultan ordered the rebellion to be skinned alive, and his skin was torn off. His flesh was cooked with rice. Some was sent to his children and his wife, and the remainder was put into a great dish to be given to the elephants to eat. Stop quote. I guess now you would agree why I called Muhammad bin Tughlaq a nutty character. And his antics don't end there. He ordered the capital city of Delhi to be moved to Daulatabad, which would then be centrally located for his kingdom. And during this process, his order was to move the entire city from Delhi to Daulatabad. And there is one story which is very hilarious. It's pretty wild actually. So he ordered the entire city to move to Daulatabad, and there was a blind man who refused to leave Delhi. But he was then dragged all the way from Delhi to Daulatabad, and upon his arrival, it was discovered that his limbs had dropped off and he had only one leg left. And he actually reached the new city like that. Quite wild, right? So these stories about Muhammad bin Tughlaq have become so famous that any politician today who takes an erratic decision in India, his decisions are typically called Tughlaqi Farman. And I guess demonetization was the recent one that I can remember of. Anyway, so the book is filled with a lot of these anecdotes which are very amusing, and Manu Pillai has a lot of references for these incidents. So personally for me, since I'm trained as a researcher, and the way the book is written with loads of references to the said incidents makes me appreciate the book even more. So coming back to a nutty character Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he realized he had committed a great mistake by moving the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, and within a decade he decided to move back to Delhi, and that ended the regime of the Delhi Sultanate in the Deccan region. And this was followed by Bahmani Sultanate, whose first Sultan was by the name Hassan Gangu. There are several stories on why his second name of this Bahmani Sultan has more Hindu origin, and the author mentions all of them and shows us what were the conspiracy theories that went back then. After going through the history of Deccan up to the Bahmani Sultanate briskly, The second story I'd like to touch upon is of the 8th Bahmani Sultan by the name Firoz Shah. He was very intellectual. He knew Persian, Telugu, Marathi, Gujarati, Bengali, and could read Hebrew Bible. He studied botany, geology, and also logic. He also taught highborn kids in his free time. And Firoz Shah was very broad minded and he appointed Hindu Brahmins to the high posts in his court. And his broader outlook towards life didn't just end there. He had a prodigious sexual appetite. And his Sunni religion, however, would not allow him to explore his entire appetite. So he followed Shia customs to have mutah marriage, which is basically marriage for pleasure. As a consequence, his harem featured Jewish, Christian, and also Russian, Chinese, Afghani, and wives from other central parts of Asia. And it's said that he could speak to all of them in their mother tongue. Quite a character, isn't he? And he also had daughter of the king of Vijayanagar as his wife. And this was the first time a Muslim sultan had married to a Hindu princess from south. And that is why you could see an influence of Carnatic culture in his court. So as we see, Firoz Shah definitely knew how to enjoy his life, but he also meant business. He wanted to make Deccan as the capital for arts and culture in the Eastern world, an international cosmopolitan. He used to send empty ships overseas to get talent from Persia, Iraq, Yemen, and not just Muslim nations, but also other countries from Europe. And in doing this, he did not forget the local customs. He maintained Brahmins as scholars in his court and saved the high military post for his Muslim generals. So looks like back in the day, Firoz Shah knew that immigration is a really good thing for his land because immigrants come to his country to earn fortune and in return work very hard. I guess we can call Deccan as the first land of immigrants before the United States. Anyway, with such international flavor and culture in his land, he made a city called Firozabad out of Gulbarga. And this town was a combination of a lot of cultural influences from across the world. And Firoz Shah was truly a visionary sultan. So during this time, Taimur, a Persian, took over the Delhi Sultanate in the north. And when this happened, Firoz Shah right away sent his ambassadors to the north with some welcome gifts as a part of international relations. This led to a strong friendly ties between the Iranian Sultan in Delhi and Firoz Shah's Bahmani Sultanate. This shows that he had a foresight that he could not fight with the giant Delhi Sultanate, so it was good for him to be friends with them. To get some insight into the secular nature of the kingdoms back then, Manu Pillai mentions a very interesting fact. He mentions that the death anniversary of Firoz Shah is not based on some Hijri calendar but is according to Hindu lunar calendar. And the ceremonies are presided not by some Muslim priest or some Sufi saint but by Lingayats of Madiyal. So you see, Deccan has a history of such visionary leaders and a culture which is a mixture of cultures from around the world. With heavy immigration from Iran over the years, they led to two factions in the Delhi Sultanate court. The first were the Muslims from the north, which had Turkic origin, and the others were the Muslims from the Persian land. This led to a conflict and eventual decline of the Bahmani Sultanate. So if you see, the decline of Bahmani Sultanate was not because of some outside invader, but due to an internal rebellion of five governors who we popularly know as Nizam Shah, Adil Shah, Qutub Shah, Barid Shah, and Imad Shah. So the nature of rebellion kind of runs in the veins of the people in the Deccan region. So if you look at it this way, it will start making more sense why even today in the southern part of India we do not have a lot of central political parties or the national parties ruling, but we have regional parties ruling over the decades. Moving on, the third story I'd like to touch upon is the most fascinating one according to me. It's about an Ethiopian king that ruled some part of Deccan and his name was Malik Ambar. As we just saw that there were a lot of immigrants coming from central part of Asia, Europe to the Deccan region. But among them were also slaves that the Bahmani sultans got from Africa and primarily from Ethiopia. Malik Ambar was one such slave who came to the Deccan as a part of exchange of human goods. So Malik Ambar was born in 1548 in Ethiopia, who was captured as a boy and sold to an Arab. In Baghdad, he was passed to some other owner who then eventually sold him to a man who brought Malik Ambar to India. Malik Ambar's original name was Chapu, but during this process, when he left Ethiopia and came to India, at some point, probably he's changed his religion to Islam and took the name Malik. And Malik Ambar's first owner was a Peshwa of Ahmednagar. To all the listeners, Peshwa is a title given to the chief minister or the prime minister of a state. And by the way, Peshwa is not even an Indian name, it is a Persian name which also means chief minister. So, Peshwa is not the only Marathi word which has its roots in Persian language. There are other words like thousand in Marathi and Persian is said as hazar. A factory is called karkhana in Marathi as well as in Persian. An intelligent person is called hushar in Marathi as well as in Persian. Small or tiny is called barik in Marathi as well as in Persian. So you see, there is such a huge influence of the Persian culture and language in Marathi. And I'm pretty sure Persian has a huge influence on other South Indian languages like Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, and Malayalam. And if you talk to some Iranian today, he would probably not pronounce the word similar to Indians. But it's also because the Persian language has evolved in Iran over centuries, and so is Marathi and other South Indian languages. Anyway, so Ambar was very devoted to this owner or this Peshwa, and when the Peshwa died, his widow granted this young Malik Ambar his freedom and let him live his own life. So for the next 20 years, Ambar was a mercenary and he used to serve various kings in the Deccan region for money. In 1590, Malik Ambar had about 150 cavalrymen in his command, and by 1600, this number rose to almost 7,000, and which included a lot of Marathas and other Dakhinis, or basically Southerners. It was a multiracial, multi ethnic force that was very different from the northern Mughals. Malik Ambar's favorite technique was to unleash guerrilla warfare on the slow moving Mughal armies. And this military technique of guerrilla warfare was taken up by Shivaji later and improved it to make it perfect. And probably this is not the only thing Shivaji had taken inspiration from Malik Ambar. So Malik Ambar had descended on the Mughals with 50,000 horses and sacked Surat, which is one of the important ports in the Mughal Empire. And the same thing Shivaji had done 5 decades later. And trust me, this is no coincidence. So Shivaji's grandfather, Maloji, was a right-hand man of Malik Ambar. So Manu Pillai in his book writes that this entire army of Malik Ambar was basically a Habshi Maratha enterprise, where Habshi means African. So this army of Malik Ambar was basically an Habshi Maratha enterprise, and this continued until I guess 1626, when Malik Ambar was approaching 80 years old and he died of natural causes in his fort, and he was undefeated by them. Mughals could never defeat him. So personally, I didn't know about this history of Deccan before I came across it in this book. So this book has many such stories which are unfortunately lost in our history. It talks about how the idea of religion was just for political optics for the kingdom, and the kings did not really differentiate the masses based on religion. It has stories on how lots of diamonds and precious stones from Deccan were taken to Iran and are still lying there in their assets. One of such amusing story in the book tells how a goat herd from a region that is modern day Andhra gave away a big shiny stone, possibly diamond, for some rice. The book is filled with such amusing instances and stories, and it is a nice fast read through the history of Deccan before Shivaji. Most of the other books which talk about the history of Deccan are on life of Shivaji. And Shivaji was a great conqueror and he deserves the place he has in the history. But other such fascinating stories about Deccan just got sidelined. So I recommend this book to all the history buffs. It's rated at about 3.9 on Goodreads, and it is a fast paced short book. It's like a crash course for the history of Deccan with a lot of witty writing, entertaining, and very informative stories. I would like to rate it 4.5, but the only reason I would rate it 4 is because it's very short. The book has a lot of stunning instances that reminds us how important and entertaining our history was in the first place. I'd like to end our discussion on the book with a quote. I forgot where I read it and I don't even remember who wrote it. Anyway, it goes something like this, and I quote: greatest gift you can ever have is foresight, and the fuel of foresight is in understanding the hindsight. Stop quote. So, what this quote tells us is we should study everything that led us up to what we are today, and that's the only way we will understand what our future course will be. Switching to a brewing section of the episode, and today it's about coffee. It's one of the oldest type of coffee known to us. It's about Turkish coffee. The coffee itself is not very special, but it is made with coffee beans that are very finely ground and added with sugar in water to boil in a long neck special pot called shezwe. It's made to boil and taken off the heat and again made to boil, and this is done 2 or 3 times to get our final Turkish coffee ready. This form of boiling and letting the froth come over your drink is very similar to how we make tea in India. Since the coffee grounds are so extremely fine, the coffee tends to have kind of a muddy texture. And probably that's why I personally don't enjoy making Turkish coffee. And since the coffee is so finely ground, it has a larger surface area exposed to the boiling water, and that's why the extracted coffee comes out to be very strong. And it might also turn out to be bitter, but and that's why the sugar is added at the beginning. Unlike other coffees, Turkish coffee distinguishes itself by adding sugar at the beginning, and I think that plays a role in getting a froth during the boiling process. So let your Turkish coffee settle down a bit and enjoy your drink. Do let me know how you like this episode and if you have any recommendations for book, coffee, or beer you'd like me to discuss. My email ID is booksandbrewpodcast@gmail.com. For more such episodes, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast from. Please do like and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to. Until next episode, spread the word, keep reading, happy listening. Music for this episode was given by Rahul Thomre.